Hasn't COVID disrupted our lives this year? And certainly in sport and F1, it's been a huge disruptor. Now, in Australia, at the moment, there is some talk that next year's Australian Grand Prix might not happen in Melbourne. It could happen in South Australia, in Adelaide, or actually near Adelaide. And I'll go through the details in just a moment. The Australian Grand Prix home is in Melbourne, and it has been since 1996. But prior to that, from 85 to 95 inclusive, the Australian Grand Prix was held in Adelaide, around the streets, and it was a great event. Lots of atmosphere. Anyone who went there would have known that the Rundle Street, the western end, one end of Rundle Street, was always an absolute buzz after the races each night. Lots of pubs, lots of great venues to go to. So, will COVID disrupt next year's Australian Grand Prix? Look, I don't think it could possibly be held in Melbourne in, March, when it's normally held. It'll either go to the end of the year, where perhaps travel is more definite. It could be cancelled altogether for another year, but maybe even it could move to Adelaide. And I'll tell you why. Because the Bend Motorsport Complex, which is about an hour and 10 minutes from Adelaide, which is not out of the question that you could stay in Adelaide, drive up to the Bend. Now, this is a beautiful motor complex, pretty new. It's built to grade 2 standards. So when you say what is a grade 2 compared with a grade 1, all F1 tracks need to be grade 1, and that's approved by the FIA. The Bend management have already said they could get the track upgraded in time to meet the grade 1 requirement. The primary differences in the work that would need to be done to get it from grade 2 to 1 is in the debris fencing and the runoff areas. Already, this particular track is hosting 2 rounds of the V8 Supercars event, which is the equivalent of, DTM in Germany. So they have got 2 races in a row. They've managed to get those races because South Australia is almost clear of COVID. Victoria, on the other hand, is having a devil of a time with it. They initially had their 6 or 7 weeks of lockdown, came out of it for 2 weeks, and then bang, straight back into it for another 6 weeks when cases just absolutely skyrocketed. And I'm not sure that they're going to be in any real position to be running a race like an F1 Grand Prix in the early part of next year. And I guess being a street track, they need a lot of advance notice because, of course, they have to set up this track. Now, the one in South Australia, out at Tailem Bend, is a purpose-built track. So effectively, with a couple of weeks' notice, I guess, you could get in there, do the work required, and get it up and running. And I always used to remember and perhaps laugh, because I am an Adelaide boy and used to love going to that Adelaide Grand Prix. They called Melbourne the home of the Adelaide Grand Prix because they stole it from us many years ago. And while I'm sure it's not at the top of the owner's mind that it would be great to win that race back for probably only a year, I'm sure that he would delight in showcasing his particular venue for an F1 race in early next year, if indeed Australia has chosen to kickstart the season. But of course, F1 is in no position now to be making any commitments, because so much can happen, as we've found out. Things can change very quickly. So I imagine that calendar next year won't be rock solid come October, when normally they put the calendar in place for next year. I think they're going to have to wait for some time to see what happens with COVID around the world and see whether or not the normal venues, all the flyaway races, are still valid for next year. Certainly Australia has fared well in terms of COVID. And if you look at the state that I'm living in here in Western Australia, I think we've only had 18 or so deaths and maybe 600 cases compared with Victoria, which is completely sky high, and the rest of Australia not too bad. But we've been spared most of the drama that, say, America or Europe has had to endure. So getting back to an F1 race in Adelaide, there is a chance that they could snare the event for the 1 year, and I think they would be pretty much doing Victoria a favour. If Victoria cannot get this race changed from earlier in the year to later in the year, and F1 decides to fly away to these races, I think they would very seriously look at a race in South Australia. And maybe the Adelaide Grand Prix ends up back in Adelaide, albeit an hour and a bit from the city of Adelaide. And before I let you go, a reminder that you can find all of my F1 driver photo books available online to order at kimillman.com, shipped to almost all countries around the world. You'll see my podcasts and blogs at the same place. You'll find all of my pictures at prostarpics.com. And if you're looking for my best pictures and stories throughout the week, go to Instagram at Kim Illman. Thanks for watching this shorter than normal video, And remember, stay passionate. Yes.